This is the Asia Trade. I'm Paul Allen in Sydney, where the markets have just opened. The top stories this hour.
The golden age of America begins right now. Today, I will sign a series of historic executive orders. With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense.
Donald Trump sealing an historic political comeback as he's sworn in as the 47th US president, promising to take on what he calls a radical and corrupt establishment. The president set to sign executive orders on energy and climate, immigration, federal workers and gender, but he's holding off on immediate tariffs on China, instead calling for a study on unfair trade practices. Well, that news set to boost Asian and US stocks while sending the dollar to its worst day in more than a year. Well, we've just opened for trade here in Australia, one of the first markets that gets a chance to react to the inauguration of the incoming president and, of course, some of the policies we expect to see. We've got the ASX up about 0.1% right now. Just one stock to watch at the open. BHP's just popped more than 1%. Second quarter iron ore output there edging up 1% on year. That reflects sluggish Chinese demand. Copper output surging 17%. So BHP, world's biggest miner there, retaining its full year output. Let's take a look at currencies, though. That's where a lot of the action is happening. We've got a slightly stronger yen, 155.65. The yuan at 726.30 there. We've seen a gauge of EM currencies, the MSCI EM currency index. That's climbed 1/3%. The Mexican peso up 1.3% against the dollar. The US dollar, meanwhile, slipping, having its worst day since 2023 on this possibility of delayed tariffs. We're going to get to that story in just a moment. Let's take a look at how US futures are tracking. Meanwhile, of course, markets there closed for Martin Luther King Day. If we take a look at futures, though, they're edging higher as well. Trump, of course, as we mentioned, promising a new golden age for the United States, but that report also that he intends to delay China tariffs, negotiate with China first, study tariff options and trade relations as well. Well, that's buoying equities futures as well. Might see a drop in yields when cash markets reopen, though. The expectation is we could see a 4 to 6 basis point drop across the curve on some of those policies that Trump mentioned. Also, the oil price a little bit weaker. Well, why? Trump has also declared in his speech a national energy emergency to, quote, drill, baby, drill, and refill the strategic oil reserve right to the top. Okay, let's break down President Trump's pledges and orders on day one. Our political news director, Jody Schneider, joins us in Washington. Also with us, our chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel in Hong Kong. Bloomberg editor Michael Heath joins me here in Sydney as well. Jody, let's start with you. A number of key announcements there. It was hard to keep up sometimes. A golden age, America first. These are all familiar themes. What were some of the key takeaways from the inauguration speech?
Yeah, that first speech, Paul, the actual inauguration speech, which of course was held inside rather than traditionally outside because of the weather, was big on thematics. It was done by a teleprompter. It was a planned speech. He talked about kind of this golden age that Donald Trump wants to bring in, undoing many of the policies of his predecessor, and was critical of Joe Biden's administration, talked about drilling, exploration on federal lands for oil and gas, talked about undoing policies that the other administration had around gender, around climate. But then in another speech that he gave to a bigger group of supporters, not necessarily the lawmakers and dignitaries of the first speech, he was more unleashed. He talked a lot about retribution and also talked a lot about how the mistakes that were made in the previous administration. Also talked about how he still thinks he won the 2020 election. So it was much more a campaign speech, a Donald Trump signature kind of rally speech, and he's about to give another one of those speeches at the Capital One Arena in just a few minutes.
Well, Jody, one thing we have been promised is a whole flurry of executive orders on day one as well. What sorts of things are we anticipating, and could we see a few curveballs in there?
Yeah, he didn't talk about tariffs in his inaugural speech, so we don't necessarily expect tariffs today, but we could see energy-related executive orders, certainly something on the U.S.-Mexico border.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about the tariffs situation. The president suggesting that, well, as you say, Jody, they might not happen on day one. Let's hear from President Trump himself.
Instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, we will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
All right, let's get to Stephen Engel now for a little bit more on this. So President Trump calling for a study, no tariffs on day one. What is this, a negotiating tactic, or is it something else?
Well, the tariff threat is very much on the table, obviously, and I spent the last week in Shanghai talking to a number of Chinese companies as well as Americans who are doing business there, and the concern was a lump sum of tariffs on day one, and we've been debating about whether day one was literal or was more a figure of speech. Well, right now, in the early hours after that inauguration, I guess it was a figure of speech, but that means it is still very much a high priority. He didn't necessarily name China like he has in the past, except for other issues, the Panama Canal, which we'll get to in just a bit. But it does mean that they're going to launch a review of global trade practices by all trading partners, not just China, as well as an administration review of the first trade deal that he signed with China to avert, at least in the early going, all those tariffs of more than $300 billion on Chinese goods. Of course, they did get enacted, but he wants to have an investigation onto whether China has complied with the terms of that first trade deal, including those agricultural purchases, which he claims China did not necessarily fulfill its pledges. Granted, there were a bunch of issues that derailed that, including, of course, the launch of COVID globally. So, again, it's maybe a relief to the markets that we're not getting this big slew of tariffs, and he's promised a lot of them, 60% across the board on all Chinese products, including 10 to 20% tariffs on all imported goods. And on top of that, there was 25% threatened tariffs on Mexico and Canada, as well as an additional 10% on China because of border issues and fentanyl. Those are going to wait, I guess, right now. It could still come in the coming weeks, days, months, and it is still very much a front burner issue.
You mentioned Panama there a minute ago, and we've heard from Panama. It's going to audit a Chinese company that controls 2 ports along the Panama Canal. Are we already seeing signs of a country caving in to Trump rhetoric?
No, I don't think Panama's caving in. The Panamanian president has said the Chinese are not operating the port itself. All naval vessels, including those of the United States, are all charged similarly and treated similarly. The Chinese-linked company you're talking about is CK Hutchison Holdings, which is Chung Kong Hutchison, operated obviously by Li Ka-shing, giant empire here in Hong Kong. They are a port operator, a global port operator, and apparently they do operate a couple of ports around and near the Panama Canal. The Panamanian president has said the Chinese are not operating the canal itself. But you're absolutely right, Paul. They have launched an audit. They have sent auditors to the local offices of CK Hutchison to do a complete review of the concession that was granted to CK Hutchison first in 1998 and then renewed in 2021 to make sure that they are abiding by the terms of that concession. But there are 2 different narratives going on here from the Panamanian side as well as from Donald Trump, who essentially said China is operating the Panama Canal and we didn't give it to China. We gave it to Panama and we're taking it back. The Panamanian president says he has no intention of ceding control back to the United States. Stay tuned.
Right, this is a good moment to talk about foreign policy. I want to get to Mike Heath now, and Mike, let's start in the Middle East. Plenty to talk about here. First off, making sure the ceasefire in Gaza endures, and secondly, could be some big sanctions coming on Iran that might cause a bit more upheaval in energy markets. What are we looking at?
Yeah, the talk at the moment with Iran is that the Trump administration will revert to its first term policy of maximum pressure. And Iran, geopolitically at least, it's sort of reeling after the defeat of Hezbollah, or the degrading of Hezbollah. It took a lot of punishment there. Hamas obviously has taken some as well. And then most significantly, the collapse of the Syrian regime that had been an ally of Iran, and it was a key transport hub, corridor, for arms coming from Iran to Hezbollah and to other proxies around there. So the possibility of major sanctions on it, and there's talking about a $30 billion hit to Iran. Its economy is in a really difficult position. It has rolling blackouts despite having very large gas reserves, because it just it doesn't have the money to invest in the infrastructure. So it could be all sorts of problems for the Iranian regime, and it's obviously not very popular with its population. So more suffering on the economic front. It could be really, really tough times there. As to to Gaza, obviously we've had these wonderful scenes of 3 hostages being released. The next round of hostages being released is supposed to happen on Saturday. But at the same time, we've had a lot of Palestinian prisoners who've been released in turn. And we've had these images of Hamas coming out on trucks afterwards once the ceasefire came, which were probably disturbing for everybody watching that. So in 2 weeks' time, they're supposed to start beginning the talks on moving from a ceasefire to a permanent peace. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that he wants to maintain the option to be able to restart the war should Hamas remain in power. Now, Hamas is probably not going to move from power, so how we go in 2 weeks' time is going to be really interesting to watch.
And let's turn to the question of Ukraine as well, because, of course, Trump promised to get this wrapped up quickly on the campaign trail. So what's next in terms of achieving this? Are we going to see talks with Vladimir Putin?
Well, Putin has said he's open to talks, which is a good start. And the administration, its officials, have been backtracking a bit on the ending the war within a day. They're now talking, 100 days or 6 months, that sort of time frame, which is more realistic. There's a difficulty there for President Trump now, though. He's obviously got huge leverage over Ukraine in terms of weapon supplies and aid and financing, that sort of thing. He doesn't have much leverage over Russia and over Putin, unlike, say, in the Middle East, where he does with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There's been talk that they'd offer some relief on sanctions for oil companies, but that's unlikely to shift the dial for Russia. So Ukraine doesn't want to capitulate, and the difficulty for Donald Trump is he almost has this obsequious attitude towards Vladimir Putin. But what he's going to find is that if he's going to get a deal with Russia, he's going to need to build Ukraine back up, so that Russia is going to have to pay a price if it wants to continue the war. But that's sort of at odds with his own feelings about it. So how he reconciles that's going to be really interesting to watch.
All right. Bloomberg's political news director Jody Schneider, Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel, and Bloomberg editor Michael Heath. Plenty to unpack there. And we didn't even mention that former President Joe Biden's used his final minutes in office to grant blanket pardons to 5 family members. The full and unconditional pardons for any non-violent offences committed since 2014 were announced just 21 minutes before Biden ceded power to President Trump. Now, apart from his brothers, sister and 2 of their spouses, Biden also granted preemptive pardons to members of a committee who investigated the January 6th insurrection and to infectious diseases expert Anthony Fauci. Coming up on the Asia Trade, we're going to ask the former US ambassador to Malta what's in store for US allies as Donald Trump takes office. Barclays joins us to talk FX strategy, and we'll discuss the controversies around Australia's National Day. First, though, more on the market reaction to Donald Trump's decision to hold off on immediate tariffs on China. We'll have much more on that ahead. This is Bloomberg. Let's take a look at our US futures tracking. Of course, the market was closed in the US today for Martin Luther King Day, but futures are pushing quite a bit higher at the moment. Of course, President Trump, among the few speeches that he's made since his inauguration, promising a new golden age for the US, but also the suggestion that tariffs against China may be delayed. Could be a negotiation first as the administration studies tariff options and trade relations. The market like that. We've got US bond futures ticking up as well. We might see a mild drop in yields when cash markets open later. Well, let's get some more on the investor reactions so far to President Trump's inauguration speech. Garfield Reynolds joins us now. He leads our Markets Live Asia coverage. So, Garfield, I just want to start on some of the moves that we've seen since Trump announced or suggested there might be a study instead of tariffs against China. We've got a softer US dollar, higher futures, as I mentioned. But look, is any of this sustainable? Is the best we can say is perhaps brace for volatility?
Well, I think there's a chance that we get something a little bit more positive than that. Those were some very strong moves overnight, underscored just how much concern there was that Trump would be willing to disrupt markets by pursuing very aggressively his tariffs. So it's almost setting up for something of an inverse of last time round, where a lot of people didn't really believe coming into the Trump presidency that he would be as aggressive on tariffs as he ended up being. This time around, everybody went to price in extreme aggression, and he's at least initially shown a willingness to avoid being, precipitate on that. And something of a surprise in that it's only a couple of weeks ago that he was posting very strong messages about immediate tariffs. So it's understandable. There's been some very strong gains, in particular for currencies like the Australian dollar, South African rand, that are very exposed to trade concerns in general. By the same token, those currencies are also still noticeably lower. Like the Aussie dollar is more than 5% lower now than it was before the November election. And part of that's about Fed policy, but a lot of it is also about trade concerns. So those trade concerns are there if, in the end, Trump does end up deciding to impose strong tariffs against China, Mexico, Canada, global trade in general. You would expect to see at least some of this week's gains given back. If he continues a softer, slower approach, I think you can see currencies gain further against the US dollar.
So which assets are looking the most vulnerable to extreme moves, and which are looking the most stable at the moment?
Well, looking the most stable, that's a difficult question. There's not a huge amount of stability out there. We are all in an environment where we know that Trump is capable of turning on a dime. So, I think one asset that perhaps looks somewhat stable in what it's doing is crude oil. It's lower, and that makes a lot of sense considering Trump's moves to boost US production. He's going slower on things like pursuing Iran, which might lead to worse sanctions. So crude oil heading for gradual declines, that seems to make a lot of sense. And a stronger yen probably Garfield, also makes sense.
Got to interrupt you there. We are seeing a stronger yen right now, but we want to get back to the Capital One arena where President Trump is now speaking. Let's have a listen.
Hostages, not a good situation. The three young ladies that came home yesterday, you saw that. More coming home every day now. They're coming home. But they were hurt. They were hurt. One had her head blown off, fingers on her hand, and her hand indeed was blown off. She was trying to defend herself from a bullet being fired. You believe this? A bullet knocked off her hand. I don't know. You look at it, it's a disgrace. We never stopped praying for you, and we're so glad that you're reunited with your friends and families, and God bless you all. And some of them are just saying, no, my son is gone, but please just bring home his body. Right, Steve? Many of you have told me that your son is gone, but bring home his body. It should have never happened. 3 years, it's ridiculous. Should have never happened. Wouldn't have happened. I also want to express my tremendous gratitude to the hundreds of thousands of proud American patriots who came from all across the country to join us in this celebration. It's a celebration of a big win. And you're witnessing the dawn of the golden age of America. That's what it's going to be. We're bringing it back. We're going to bring it back fast. We're going to bring it back fast. Let us also thank the incredible service members, National Guardsmen, Police, Secret Service, and law enforcement personnel who are keeping us all safe, even though they are great people. New York's finest. I grew up with New York's finest, and we got to give them their authority back. You won't have any crime. There'll be no crime. You give them little authority back. The whole way they run things in this country now, it's disgraceful. But it's going to change rapidly. We're going to make our cities safe again, too. Even though we're indoors, we've had a magnificent inaugural parade. And let's give a big round of applause. They were great. To all of the incredible performers and hardworking men and women who made it possible. Those people, really talented, amazing people. I also want to thank my wonderful family for being here, especially my beautiful wife, our First Lady, Melania. I love our First Lady. And also, JD. How good has JD been? And his beautiful wife, Usha. How good is JB? JD has been great. He's another good negotiator, Steve. He's a great negotiator, too. We need negotiators in this country. But so many of the people on the stage behind, not only family members, as an example, Lara Trump, the wife of Eric. She was the head of the Republican Party, along with my friend Michael. Stand up, the two of you. What a job. What a job they did. They worked so hard. They knew they'd be rigging, but they said, we're going to make it too big to rig, and we did. We made it too big to rig. We won every swing state by a lot. We won the popular vote by millions and millions of votes. We won the whole ball of wax. And now we're going to go and drill, baby, drill, and do all the things that we've wanted to do and bring your costs down, your prices down, and make our country safe. So thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much. What a job you've done, Michael. I'm never moving you, you know. He was thinking about getting a nice job in the administration. I said, no, I'm leaving you right where you are. You've done a very good job. We're not moving you, Michael. I'm sorry. Anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Appreciate it very much. Right here with us also in the arena, I'm about to sign some very important executive orders of our new administration. Hey, Don, will you stand up, please? Don is another one. How about Don? This guy. He's a popular one. He goes out and speaks. He gets a big crowd. He's a little on the rough side sometimes, but that's what you want. He's done a fantastic job, and he loves our country.
All right, subscribers can also turn to the Bloomberg to get more on what we're seeing here. You can go to TLive Go, that's TLIV Go, get commentary and analysis from our expert editors as President Trump addresses the crowd there at the Capital One Arena. Well, South Korea is on alert after supporters of impeached President Yoon stormed a courthouse at the capital minutes after a fresh warrant to detain Yoon was issued on Sunday. Some supporters climbed over the wall, others smashing through barricades. Bloomberg's Denny Thompson joins us now from Seoul. So, Denny, we've got some dramatic scenes there in Seoul. What's the risk of more civil unrest in the days ahead?
Paul, so this was one of incident in the past probably 6 weeks, and a lot of people say it's not going to repeat itself. And today, President Yoon will be appearing in the Constitutional Court as part of the impeachment trial. and as a precaution, security has been beefed up. But overall, I mean, the sentiment here is that that was kind of a one-off instance and unlikely to repeat it. But people are pretty much have taken more measures to make sure that nothing of that is repeated.
Well, we've seen the Bank of Korea cutting its growth outlook for the country based not just on the unrest that we've seen, but also the return of President Trump to office. What are the risks of this sort of disorder spreading over into markets and the broader economy?
Well, you're right. So as you said, the Bank of Korea has now cut growth forecast for the country, and clearly they have taken into account the political instability, but also, as you mentioned, Trump's return is going to have an impact on the export-driven nation here, and that is another risk which people don't know how fast it comes and how damaging it could be. So, taking into all those factors, the central bank has given a kind of a dim outlook for the country. For now, again, there is a hope that the impeachment trial that is happening for President Yoon will kind of see him out of power, and that will spark a new election. And so it's going to be a kind of a long haul, but at the end of by the middle of the year, or probably a month or so later, we could see an election, and that could probably bring back stability to the country.
So we saw some pictures of President Yoon's supporters there. Polls are also showing an uptick in support for him and also his People Power Party. Is there a chance he could make a comeback?
Well, the overarching feeling here is that what Yoon did is not kosher, so he needs to go. But what has happened is this extreme measure of trying to arrest a sitting president. That's not gone well with some of his supporters, and so that has galvanized some of them to come back, and that is what is reflected in these polls. It's unclear whether the ruling party can win back support. Yoon cannot stand an election after he is impeached, but his party's approval rating has come back, so that gives a bit of hope for the ruling party to make a comeback and if the election is called. But it looks it's a pretty finely balanced act right now.
All right, Bloomberg News editor Denny Thomas there in Seoul. The latest geopolitical stories that we're following: Philippine authorities have arrested a Chinese national and 2 locals for alleged espionage. The National Bureau of Investigation says the suspects were found with spying equipment and were seen at locations including military camps and power plants. The arrests come with the 2 countries locked in a long-standing maritime dispute over parts of the South China Sea and follow claims of Chinese hacking of the Philippine government. Yemen's Houthi rebels say they'll stop attacking US and UK vessels in the Red Sea in response to the Israel-Hamas ceasefire agreement. They say in an email that ships belonging to US and UK individuals or entities are no longer subject to sanctions. However, the Houthis warn that ships owned by Israeli entities or sailing under the Israeli flag remain banned. Right, let's look ahead to the market open in Japan and elsewhere. We've got the yen. Well, let's take a look at currencies first. The yen a bit stronger against the greenback, 155.49 at the moment. Similar moves for the yuan. Not a lot of change for the euro there, but of course a lot of this is more a dollar story than anything else. We've seen the US dollar slipping, having its worst day since 2023 on the possibility of delayed tariffs. This is something the incoming Trump administration has signaled that probably not going to get Chinese tariffs on day one, as seemed to be the campaign rhetoric, but instead there will be a study of trade relations and a more considered policy going forward on this. So the dollar spot index easing back there. All right, here is what President Trump had to say, meanwhile, about his foreign policy goals in his inaugural address a little bit earlier.
My proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier. That's what I want to be, a peacemaker and a unifier.
Well, joining us now is Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley, a former ambassador to a U.S. ambassador to Malta. She's a 30-year career diplomat. She's worked for the Biden and Obama administrations and held senior positions in the State Department as well, the Defense Department and the National Security Council. Gina, as you join us, we are watching pictures of President Trump addressing the crowd at the Capital One Arena. A festive atmosphere there. He's really celebrating his victory. But in terms of policy, we did hear a few things a little bit earlier, and we've already discussed on the show the implications for China, Iran, the Middle East. But I want to talk about what might be in store for U.S. allies as well, because earlier we had Trump refusing to rule out military options to get a hold of Greenland. I mean, that's a territory administered by Denmark, which is a NATO ally. We've heard rhetoric about Canada as well. I mean, is this sort of stuff serious, or is it a bargaining approach? What is it? Have you encountered anything like this in all your years of diplomacy?
No, and thank you for the question. That definitely is not diplomacy as it is usually practiced. But we do have 4 years of experience with President Trump in his last administration, and we know that he does sometimes say things for shock value. There may indeed be interest in having a more cooperative relationship with Denmark and Greenland. We've had the Canadians respond to his suggestions that it become the 51st state. But I think that until we see differently, we can assume that this is President Trump and hyperbole, which he is very familiar with and very comfortable with.
Well, one of the closest diplomatic relationships the United States has is, of course, with the United Kingdom. It's often described as the special relationship. But at the same time, we have one of President Trump's closest confidants, Elon Musk, unleashing an absolute barrage on X pretty much every day against the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. So do you see the special relationship perhaps changing or evolving or being in any danger?
I don't believe we can yet say. And one of the things to keep in mind is that the relationship between President Trump and Elon Musk is a relatively new one. There is a balancing of power there for the world's richest man and the world's most powerful man. And how that plays out, we will see over time. I think we can all assume that if President Trump sees a pressing from Mr. Musk that might unseat or alter the balance in a way with which he is not comfortable, that Mr. Musk will be the loser between the two. So if President Trump says to Mr. Musk, you're going to have to quiet those tweets down, that's not what I want, as you are supporting the U.S. government, you've been given this Department of Economic Doge, then you're going to have to play by my rules. And that's my expectation.
Well, of course, the US and the UK also have an arrangement with Australia, which is perhaps the US's closest ally in this part of the world, and that is the AUKUS pact on nuclear submarine technology. And that this is a decades-long pact with a future that really needs to be bipartisan from all countries. There's been some nervousness in Australia about the incoming Trump administration's position on this. Do you see it surviving?
Of course. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It's a long-standing relationship, one that President Biden sought to strengthen. And it is bipartisan. Americans would be very shocked to have any sort of serious rift with the United Kingdom or Australia for that point of view, because it is such a close relationship. In any relationship, of course, there are ups and downs. Most of the time, particularly with allies, they are managed quietly behind the scenes, behind closed doors. But we do have Mr. Trump, who is often speaking publicly in ways, but then you see what happens, and it often is not as extreme as his public statements. So it's not something that, were I Australian or English, British, I would not be concerned about at this time. But of course, the diplomats have to do the work to help maintain the relationship and ensure understanding and clarity.
Gina, just stay with us. We want to have a quick listen to what the president is saying, making some remarks at the moment. I understand he's moved on from the topic we were interested in. It has been a somewhat difficult speech to keep track of. I just want to pick up on some of the remarks that he's made about China today. It appears that this intention to put tariffs on China immediately might be delayed while the incoming administration conducts a trade study. Where do you see this happening? Is perhaps the relationship going to be in better shape than we thought, or can you see the potential for a Cold War type situation?
Well, there are obviously options either way, but I would suspect that it's going to be better than we expected. Again, Mr. Trump uses hyperbole. He uses very brash statements, but he clearly can be swayed to tone down, to temper, and if he's trying to do the best for the American people, as he keeps saying, and we should take him at his word, then having a tariff war, I'm sure many are saying to him, is not necessarily the wisest way to do that. He does take the counsel of those that he considers knowledgeable, experts around him. I have friends who worked in his White House, and he does take counsel. He does listen. So I believe that if that counsel is informed enough and convincing enough, that he will do his best to manage the relationship. He is about making deals, and he has said he wants to be a peacemaker. He's not trying to bring additional conflict to the United States, and we're going to take him at his word on that as well.
All right, Gina, great to get your insights. Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley is a former U.S. ambassador to Malta and a career diplomat of 30 years. All right, well, we still have President Trump there speaking at the Capital One Arena. Let's have a quick listen.
So we're going to be going over the beautiful Oval Office, one of the great offices in history. Even if it wasn't beautiful, it's the Oval Office, but it is beautiful. And we love the Oval Office. It all starts with the wars start and end there. Everything starts and ends at the Oval Office. We love it. But we're going to go to the Oval Office. We're going to release our great hostages that didn't do, for the most part, they didn't do stuff wrong. You take a look at what went on, and look what happens in other parts of the country. In Portland, where they kill people, they destroy the city, nothing happens to them. In Seattle, where they took over a big chunk of the city, nothing happened. Minneapolis, where they burned down the city, nothing happened. Essentially nothing happened. All they want to do is go after the J6 hostages. A 76-year-old grandmother was arrested the other day because she was looking, I think because she was looking at the Capitol or something like that. No, we're not going to put up with that crap anymore. And to stop the weaponization of law enforcement, I've been investigated more than any human being in the world. I believe I have the all-time record. Every day a subpoena. Every single day would get subpoenas. I was more than any person. Alphonse Capone, remember I used to talk about it? Now, Alphonse Capone, Scarface, he was a pretty rough guy. He was investigated about 1/100th what Trump was investigated. My father's looking down at me, my mother, how the hell did this happen? You know what it is? They investigated their political opponent, the opponent of Biden, and then ultimately Kamala. Has anyone ever heard of Kamala? We had to beat two opponents, you know? We had to beat Biden, then we beat him. Now he goes on top. The guy was like 39 points down. I think I could have beaten Trump. They should have left me and I would have beaten. No, his debate performance wasn't the best, right? That's what killed him. And then they had to change, and that's like you get into a fight. The great Dana White spoke last night. We love Dana White, right? UFC. That's like he puts in two fighters, one of them's getting creamed, getting really beaten, and they say, all right, take him out, let's put somebody else in to finish up the fight. That's what they did to us. They gave us somebody new, but we took care of both of them. So we beat actually two opponents. But to stop the weaponization of law enforcement and our government, I will also sign an order directing every federal agency to preserve all records pertaining to political persecutions under the last administration, of which there were many, and beginning the process of exposing any and all abuses of power, even though he's pardoned many of these people. Can you believe it? He's pardoned them. You know why he did it while I was speaking? Because that way I couldn't speak about it. I was speaking. I didn't know he did it. I finished my speech, and they said, sir, he pardoned his whole family. I said, ooh, can I go back out there and talk about it? Somehow that wouldn't be very elegant. Our First Lady would say, please don't do that. But we have plenty of time to talk about it, and we will. We're doing all of this on our very first day in office. You know, don't forget, we've been in this position, really, where we won the primaries in record time. We were the fastest win of a primary ever in political history, which is a very nice thing. It's nice to know. Well, the second election was rigged, so we knew we were doing well. And if it wasn't, you know what? If it wasn't, I would have never run. But the third one was just a monster. Boy, was that a big one, huh? That was a big one. On the second one, we got like 10 or 12 million votes more than the first one. How about that? We did great on the first one. We did much better on the second one. But bad did we do well on the third one. So we're gonna have some fun. It's very simple. We're gonna make our country great. We're gonna make our country great again. We're gonna make America great again. How good a name is MAGA, though, right? You know? I was going to say, keep America great, but unfortunately it wasn't great. Can't say keep it great. It will be great again, but CAG, keep America great, CAG, I don't think it's ever going to replace MAGA. Does anybody like CAG? I don't think so. It's never replacing MAGA. Nothing will ever replace MAGA. MAGA was the most successful political operation, political movement in the history of our country, maybe in the history of the world. Let's see what happens, because we're not finished yet. We're not finished yet. We got a long way to go. But we're doing this on the very first day in office, and in just a few moments, I'm not only signing the release of the J6 hostages, I'm signing other things that you're going to love. Oh, you're going to be happy reading newspapers tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day. So I just want to thank, I mean, look at this place. It's full to the rafters. You don't have any. Look at those people up there. You don't have any empty seats. And by the way, the Capital One owners, they are so good. We got to root for their teams because they have been so great to MAGA, to us. And I just want to thank Ted and everybody. You guys have been fantastic. And the ice hockey team's doing great. Ovechkin's pretty good, right? They're doing great. So I want to thank them, Capital One arena owners. They have been absolutely fantastic. And thank you once again to everyone. And I can only tell you, you're going to be very happy. You're going to watch a lot of good things happen. We got to stop some wars that are happening and going on. Some stupid things are happening. The war with Ukraine would have never happened, and it has. As you know, Israel would have never been hit on October 7th, and none of you would be up here, none of you would even know anything about this tragedy that you're going through right now. But Iran was broke. Anybody that bought oil from Iran, they couldn't do any business with us. You're not going to do business with America. China passed, everybody passed, they were broke. They didn't have money for Hamas, they didn't have money for Hezbollah. And your sons would be alive, and they certainly wouldn't be incarcerated like they are. It's such a shame, but we're getting a lot of people out in a short period of time. So I'm going to go right over to here, and I'm going to sign in front of you. Is that okay? Good.
There we have President Trump. He's finished with his remarks. He's now heading over to a table to sign a number of executive orders that he says voters are going to be very, very happy about. But he's just pausing on his way to that table to meet with some of the family members of people who have hostages still being held by Hamas. Very pleased with what the president is doing for them. He makes his way down the line there. So he's promising a number of executive orders, a flurry of executive orders, among them an intention to pardon the January 6, well, he referred to them as hostages, but of course they're not. But he will pardon those people who were caught up in the riots at the Capitol on January 6 following his failed election bid in 2020. But of course, as he mentioned, his third shot was beyond doubt, winning both the popular vote and the Electoral College. All right, so President Trump, meanwhile, says he's going to declare a national emergency, which is aimed at boosting U.S. energy production. That executive action is expected to target regulations on oil and gas production, electric vehicles and wind power. It's also going to undo many Biden-era climate policies as well. So for more on this, let's get to Bloomberg senior energy reporter Stephen Stapczynski. So, Stephen, a national emergency, in the words of the president, there's an intention to drill, baby, drill. So what's going to happen now, and what are the implications for the oil price?
So first off, calling it a national emergency seems to be some sort of political move by him. It really doesn't mean anything. Having a national emergency on energy doesn't exactly unlock new powers, but it does illustrate how seriously he is taking this segment. He just said in these comments before that the U.S. has more oil and gas than anyone, and he wants to drill more of it. Now, the biggest challenge is to convince the private sector to drill. The U.S. doesn't have publicly owned energy companies. Everything is drilled by small shale players or major big oil companies dotting from Pennsylvania to Texas. So now he's going to have to go up to them and say, do you want to produce more? How will you produce more? Because at the moment, where oil prices are, they're quite comfortable. If they produce more, that risks oil prices falling. They don't want to result in a glut of supply. Now, the regulations that he could change would be kind of clearing the way for more drilling and more licenses on federal land. That's still not a very large portion of all the available land that could be used to drill. So what he does from the president's point of view will have relatively little impact. I think it's more the political rhetoric and the view there that he's showing off at the moment to gain some more support in the industry, where some had felt that they were unfairly targeted under the Biden administration. It's still, again, unclear how he's going to convince everyone to boost oil and gas production, but it is something that clearly he cares a lot about.
Well, that's the domestic side of things. It's understood the incoming administration is also looking at some very big sanctions on Iranian oil, a package of measures there. What's the impact of that going to be on an Iranian budget, which is in a pretty bleak place at the moment, but also China, which was the destination for a lot of those Iranian oil exports?
You know, sitting here in Singapore, there are a lot of oil traders, and they have been worried about more action from the Trump administration to hit Iran, either with new measures or just sort of enforcing the measures and the sanctions that had existed before. A lot of Iranian oil was being shipped on shadow fleet vessels, kind of under the view of different government officials, but still something that the market saw as necessary to help kind of balance things and make sure that prices didn't get too high. If the Trump administration were to put stronger enforcement on these sanctions or put new restrictions against Iran, that's going to really destroy one large area of revenue for the Iranian government, but as well kind of reduce the amount of flows out of this major oil-producing country where they would be going to places like China or India. Now, there are other options in the market for oil, but you've seen a run-up, sort of an increase in oil prices from the beginning of the year, due in part to this expectation that there will be a harder line on Iran. So the more the U.S. were to restrict it, the more the U.S. were to target these vessels, the shadow fleet, you're going to see prices continue to rise, which is an interesting problem because, yes, on the one side, it does kind of curb Iran's ability to fund their government, but at the other side, it risks higher oil prices, and higher oil prices mean higher gasoline prices at home, which is something Trump also does not want.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, as you're speaking there, we are watching President Trump sign a number of executive orders. I'll run through what they are in just a moment. But the sixth item was a withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty. So what's the fallout from this going to be?
You know, I think this doesn't come as an enormous surprise. There was already an expectation since he did that in his first term. I think the one thing to watch, governments are setting their 2035 carbon reduction, their pollution reduction targets, their NDCs, and governments are all revising them. They have to revise them by February and send them to the UN. The U.S. won't be part of that, and without the U.S. kind of leading this charge, you could see other governments around the world also look at maybe reducing their ambitions to kind of rein in climate change. This could create a split between countries and governments. You know, the EU is quite committed to it, but there might be other countries, perhaps in Asia, developing countries, that don't want to do anything that could reduce their economic growth, anything that could curb their ability to continue competing on the world stage by reducing their pollution. So all that together is going to create potentially a void in what could become a really important fight to reduce emissions. On the other end, China, surprisingly, the world's biggest CO2 emitter, has come out to say that they could take the charge in fighting climate change and kind of rally countries around them as potentially a climate leader. Now, that does seem oxymoron in that view, but at the same time, they do have to reduce emissions under their current energy or their government plans that they have, their 5-year plans. They are aiming to peak emissions this year. They're an enormous producer of solar panels, the world's biggest, and they're by far the largest investor in green technology, and they want to absolutely own that sector.
Yep. All right, Bloomberg senior energy reporter Stephen Stapczynski there. Okay, President Trump preparing to leave the stage. He did sign a big stack of executive orders there. I'll tell you what they were. The first one, rescinded 78 Biden-era executive orders. Item number 2 was a regulatory freeze, which prevents more bureaucrats from issuing any more regulations until we have full control of the government. Third item was a freeze on all federal hiring, except in the military and a number of other excluded categories, again, until full government control is achieved. Item number 4 was a requirement that federal workers return to full-time in-person work immediately, so that's the end of work from home. The fifth executive order was a directive to every department to address the cost of living. It's likely to be popular. And the sixth item, as we were discussing with Stephen there, was the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Treaty. The seventh executive order was a directive to the federal government, restoring the restoration of freedom of speech, preventing censorship, and finally, a directive ending the weaponization of government against political adversaries of the previous administration. So 8 executive orders signed there, and at the conclusion of which, you threw those pens into the crowd. So a nice keepsake for a few lucky members of the crowd there in the Capital One arena. During that, we also had the news that Marco Rubio has been confirmed by the Senate as Trump's Secretary of State. So busy day for President Trump rolls on. He's leaving the Capitol arena there, the crowd in good spirits. Market opens coming up in Seoul and Tokyo next. Let's watch for the reaction. This is Bloomberg.
This is the Asia Trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens, and we will be watching the reaction to the inauguration of Donald Trump as President of the United States, and perhaps some market optimism, Paul, given that we did not see, at least for now, the sweeping trade tariffs on the first day, although we did see a series of executive orders already.
Yeah, that's right. We've had 8 executive orders signed just now at the Capital One Arena, and more to come today. I mean, this was promised, but as you say, the market's really liking that news that there's going to be perhaps a more nuanced approach towards trade with China.
Yeah, we saw the immediate market reaction with the dollar plunging more than 1% in the overnight session, and that really boosting Asian currencies, including the Japanese yen, which is trading towards that 155 level against the U.S. dollar. And you can continue to see that strength right there. The Nikkei gaining more than 1% as well, including the topics. And of course, it's a big week for Japan as we head towards the inauguration, not the inauguration of Donald Trump only, but of course the Bank of Japan's policy decision later on Friday as well. The expectation is for a rate hike there. Take a look at how we're trading in South Korea as well as we get the first 20 days of trade data. And for the month of January, first 20 days, exports falling 5.1% year on year. Imports also falling 1.7% year on year. Although we have continued to see the resilience when it comes to semiconductor exports. The thing is political uncertainty in South Korea. So we continue to watch the intermittent violence in South Korea. Supporters of President Yoon are storming a courthouse in Seoul after warrant was issued for his detention, Paul.
Well, we've been trading here in Australia now for an hour, and we're seeing some pretty healthy gains on the ASX, better by almost 1% now. If we take a look at the Aussie dollar, that's strengthening as well, although we've seen some weakness for the US dollar following those remarks from President Trump. It's the US dollar having its worst day since 2023. If we take a look at yields as well, we do see the yield on the 10-year now moving by 7 basis points. That's pretty much what we were anticipating, now 4.5520. We've had a little bit of analysis from Nikko Securities as well, writing that there's avoidance of the announcement of higher tariffs. We've also just had the signing of an executive order addressing cost of living issues. Well, that does show that inflation, keeping it in check, is front of mind for President Trump, and maybe we might see a repricing of expectations around Fed rate cuts as well. So that's something else we can watch for as well. So we've got the 10-year yield dropping 8 basis points after Trump's inauguration, Shery.
Yeah, let's take a look at those executive orders and what President Trump will do in the next few days in office. He has pledged to prioritize American interests after being sworn in as the 47th U.S. president. He just signed several executive orders. Bloomberg's political news director, Jody Schneider, is in Washington and joins us now. Not surprising, he's re-signing some of President Biden's executive orders as well, saying that he'll rescind them because of his own agendas and, of course, prioritizing things like cost of living, not to mention withdrawals from the Paris Climate Agreement. What stood out to you?
Yeah, well, Shery, one of the things that's interesting about what the new President Trump is doing is he's undoing what President Biden, the former president, did in the previous few weeks and his agenda. Basically, he said he will get out of the Paris Climate Accords, that he will step away from a number of environmental issues, a number of environmental policies that the Biden administration had supported. Some of this is by executive order. Others he will just do as part of his agenda. He is pledging to pardon some of the January 6th people who participated in the January 6th attack on the Capitol 4 years ago now. And he is also going to step away from some policies, some other policies, including energy policies, saying he is going to put in effect energy policies that will expand basically federal use of federal lands for drilling. Drill, baby, drill was the call again in his inaugural speech. And we will see probably executive orders in future days. He did not call for tariffs on China or raising tariffs on other countries, which we had thought might be among the first of the orders. But instead, he is saying that he will do a review of such policies and that he thinks tariffs are a good idea, but we didn't see those on day one. The other thing we are expecting to see very soon are a raft of border policies.
Yeah, we also saw that executive order taking the US out of the Paris Climate Treaty. We're expecting that one, but a couple more as well. One, a directive to restore freedom of speech, prevent censorship, end the weaponization of government against political adversaries. I mean, in a practical sense, what does this actually mean? And kind of linked to that idea of freedom of speech, present at the inauguration, the US CEO of TikTok. Can we join the dots?
Yeah, I think this is not only about TikTok, but perhaps about Meta and other social media companies who had feared regulation, that they had started to see lots of calls for regulation under the FTC chief during the Biden administration. Now this could be for them a win in terms of, for instance, Meta has said they are removing their fact-checking and replacing it with community notes, which means anybody can say things there, and this is something that President Trump supports. And I do think we'll see this, as he said, that he very much wants to see TikTok now be able to find a buyer, an American buyer, that would allow it to remain. So again, this is a kind of thematic executive order. Hard to see how it's enforced, but it's, I think, around that whole piece around social media. The other thing that that he has said that he will do is he wants to make sure that that going forward we will see a real wholesale change in the way that speech is used. And he said this in his inaugural address regarding gender and regarding transgender, saying that there are just two genders, male and female.
And Jody, we are seeing his cabinet now slowly take shape, and perhaps the least controversial of his nominees, Marco Rubio, confirmed by the Senate as the next Secretary of State.
That's right. Marco Rubio was expected to be among the first. They had a quick committee vote today. It went well, and then the full Senate voted him through. President Trump very much wanted to see on his inauguration day at least one of his cabinet appointees confirmed, and he may get another one, or it's certainly in coming days. Scott Bessent, as Treasury Secretary, is expected to be an early one, as is Doug Burgum, the Secretary of who would be Secretary of the Interior. They had a lot of support. Marco Rubio, of course, being a senator already, being one of their own, was somebody who pretty much sailed through in terms of confirmation.
Right. Bloomberg's political news director Jody Schneider there as we continue to follow the latest developments in Washington, D.C. You can see the motorcade of President Trump now headed back to the White House. We are expecting him to continue signing those executive orders. Of course, we have seen a few of them already, including retracting and undoing some of President Biden's orders already, not to mention the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. We have heard that he plans to sign around 100 executive orders in the first days of office, so we'll continue to bring you the latest developments. But for now, let's get more on the market impact and bring in Mitul Kotecha, head of Asia FX and EM macro strategy at Barclays. Mitul, great to have you back. We have already seen the market impact, especially when it comes to dollar strength and the fact that President Trump just did not carry out sweeping trade tariffs seems to be pressuring the dollar right now. Do you still hold the view that we will see a stronger U.S. dollar if, in fact, we do see these tariffs sometime from here?
Yes, that's right, Shery. Look, I think clearly there had been a bit of a surprise at the fact that we didn't see day one tariff announcements. And, we know that Trump had warned about being very aggressive on day one. He talked about China, a few months back, 60% tariffs on China. Then an additional 10% tariffs, and of course, tariffs, 25% tariffs on Mexico, Canada. None of that has transpired, but it doesn't mean that it won't. And even though this is now an investigation, there's going to be studies carried out, and obviously this is a bit more of a slow-burning process. And as you've seen, the dollar has reacted negatively to that because some of that was priced. Some of the tariffs were already in the price. It doesn't mean the dollar won't continue to strengthen. And look, we think there's still a good chance that tariffs will be implemented. But again, a lot will depend on how these investigations pan out. But secondly, the dollar is not just rallying, or has not rallied just in the last few months, just on the back of tariff expectations, but also due to US exceptionalism, economic outperformance, relative rate differentials, and none of that really has changed dramatically. So we expect the dollar to continue to remain on the front foot in the months ahead.
Does that mean then just broad weakness for Asian currencies on the other side of that trade, or could we see more specific strength depending on economies?
Yeah, I think, look, for now, obviously, there's probably going to be a bit of respite because of the dollar weakness overnight. So it's likely we're not going to see the initial worries about a slide in Asian currencies and in the aftermath of the inauguration. But further out, there is still likely to be pressure, and we think the yuan will lead the way lower. In our view, we're still forecasting 750 by end of this year, and many other Asian currencies to weaken. But to your point, there are also idiosyncratic factors here at play. And for example, in Korea, we've had obviously significant weakness in the Korean won following the political uncertainties and upheaval that's taken place there. We would argue actually tactically probably a lot is in the price, but other currencies, we've just put out a piece on the rupee, and there we see more weakness than we'd initially expected. We're now forecasting dollar rupee at 89.5 by end of this year. So I do think there'll be idiosyncratic factors at play, but for now, at least a little bit of respite for Asia.
Yeah, in terms of some of those idiosyncratic cases, we do have a Bank of Japan decision coming up at the end of the week. We've got a yen which has strengthened, relatively speaking, now at 155. Now, to what degree are today's developments in terms of delayed tariffs going to have any impact on the thinking for the BOJ, or none at all?
Well, you would argue that BOJ had been obviously looking at US trade policy. That's been quite important. And if, for example, we'd seen pretty aggressive tariffs being announced on day one, that could have had a bearing on policy. But we do think that given the recent hawkish or return to a hawkish tone from Governor Ueda and other BOJ officials, that a hike this month now looks very likely. So we think probably on the margin it would have mattered. But the fact is that the BOJ does seem to be pushing towards a hike. And I think there's not a lot that's going to change that. Obviously, they're probably encouraged by higher inflation, wages, growth that is pushing higher, and obviously be focused on the Shunto round. But for now, what does that mean for dollar yen? Well, look, yen, we still see dollar yen moving higher before it moves lower. And that part of that is simply, even though the Bank of Japan hikes rates, US rates are still far more aggressive and more hawkish than Japan. And the yield differential still seems to play for a higher dollar yen, at least in the short term.
Are we going to see parity with the euro in 2025?
Well, it's not our forecast, but look, again, I think a lot does depend on tariffs. If we see aggressive tariffs, including on Europe, the chances are that euro-dollar could fall to parity. It's certainly been one of our model projections on the back of, say, 10% tariffs on Europe and some retaliation. So wouldn't rule that out. It's not, again, our central forecast. But, again, we don't know where things will pan out. At least the initial indication that we saw from the inauguration is that it's going to be a bit more steady as she goes in terms of potential tariffs on various countries, including on Europe. So you imagine there's going to be some relief in European markets following the announcements, which didn't really show anything aggressive as was perhaps previously worried about.
And definitely some relief on the Chinese yuan, right, given that we didn't get those China-specific tariffs at least right away. But what's the case for the longer-term outlook for the yuan if we also at the same time see perhaps more easing coming from the PBOC to support that economy?
That's right. We didn't, as you said, didn't see the aggressive tariffs on China. It doesn't mean they won't happen. We do think fundamentally the yuan will be weaker in any case, and we have forecast this 7.5 by end of this year. The risks, in our view, is if we do see aggressive tariffs on China, and for example, if we see a 60% tariff on China, dollar yuan could end up being above 8. And there's clearly pressure on the economy. We're not seeing anything significant on the stimulus side. We are focusing on the March NPC for any further large stimulus announcements, and there is potential there. But at the same time, it does seem as if there's a longer-term approach to China's economy taken from the authorities, and that perhaps means less short-term stimulus, less increase in leverage, and growth that's not going to be more aggressive this year. So, for example, we're forecasting growth not a lot above 4% for this year, and it's unlikely that's going to be positive for the yuan. So we still see downside yuan pressures in the next several months.
Mitul Kotecha, good to have you with us, head of FX and EM Macro Strategy Asia at Barclays, of course, dissecting what the next few days in the Trump administration could mean as we continue to watch some of those movers across Asia, specifically on those sectors that could be affected by the new Trump administration. We already saw that executive order to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. We'll be watching some of those renewable and green energy stocks, solar stocks as well, fossil fuels, given Trump's preference for more drilling, and of course, given the fact that we didn't see sweeping trade tariffs on the first day. Also, we are seeing some upside when it comes to the broader markets as well as some of those manufacturers. Paul.
All right, still to come, we're going to discuss the controversies around the timing of Australia's National Day, labelled Invasion Day by many First Nations people. First, though, a closer look at President Trump's tariff plans, despite holding off on targeting China on his first day in office. We have much more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, we will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
Donald Trump speaking about the trade plans that he has in place right now. The newly inaugurated president already moving markets with his decision not to slap tariffs on China right away. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index sinking the most in 14 months. For more, let's bring in our chief North Asia correspondent, Stephen Engel, in Hong Kong. So, Steve, I mean, it's very early in his administration, but we've already seen a slew of executive orders. What should we be making out of the fact that he actually decided to delay these potential tariffs on China?
You know, so much was made about day one of the presidency, version 2 of Donald Trump, that we all kind of took him for his word that day one would mean tariffs that he threatened and a number of different actions potentially against China. Now, if you're the Chinese leadership waking up this morning in Beijing, you're probably going, whew, it could have been much worse. Because, again, if he had signed with the executive orders of those tariffs of up to 60% on all Chinese exports to the United States, imports to the United States, that would immediately put China on the back foot. They would have to find retaliatory measures. They would have to find their own policy response immediately. This does buy Beijing some time. And let's keep in mind, this buys Donald Trump's administration time as well to formulate the best strategy forward. Clearly, tariffs are not on the back burner now because he didn't sign that into, executive order today. It just means that it could take weeks, months, or days for those tariffs to be announced. Because he said the taxing, instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, we will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens, quote unquote, in the inauguration speech. Now, again, there was not visceral China bashing in his inauguration speech. Han Zheng, the vice president, was also there. He met with Elon Musk. He met with other U.S. business leaders, striking a very cooperative tone, saying China's open for business. Even the TikTok CEO, Shou Chu, was there in the audience. So there was positives for China in this inauguration speech, which could have been much worse.
Steve, President Trump did mention China when he was talking about Beijing operating, or alleging that Beijing is operating, the Panama Canal. He's also vowed to take it back. How's this saga going to unfold?
Yeah, well, this was going to take some time because there's a bit of a standoff, obviously, with Donald Trump's assertion that China is operating the Panama Canal, something that the Panamanian president denies. Yes, there is a China-linked company, a Hong Kong-linked company, Panama Ports Company, which is a subsidiary of CK Hutchison Holdings, which is, of course, the big global ports operator run by Li Ka-shing's conglomerate, Hutchison Whampoa. But CK Hutchison and that subsidiary, Panama Ports, is under scrutiny for its role running a couple of ports adjacent to the Panama Canal. And the Panamanian authorities have essentially said they have sent auditors to the local representative office of Panama Ports to kind of make sure that they're adhering to the letter of the law of the concessions that were granted to CK Hutchison back in 1998 and then renewed in 2021. But again, Donald Trump is saying China is operating the Panama Canal and we didn't give it to China, he says. We gave it to Panama and we're taking it back, quote unquote, from Donald Trump. But again, the Panamanian president is telling us, Paul, or not telling us, is saying essentially that he has no intention of giving back the Panama Canal.
All right, Chief North Asia correspondent Stephen Engel there. Bloomberg has learned that Chinese officials are taking steps to stabilize operations at distressed builder China Vanke, and that's after deepening liquidity problems last week triggered turmoil for its bonds and shares. For more, let's bring in our China correspondent, Min Min Lo in Hong Kong. So, Min Min, what do we know so far?
So this is according to sources that Bloomberg has spoken to. Shenzhen officials had held a closed-door meeting last Friday to discuss Vanke. They're looking to stabilize operations. They're looking to bring in auditors, financial advisors to assess Vanke's balance sheets and its property projects to pave a way forward. So there are a lot of questions now about what this means. Does it mean the government is planning a cash injection for the company, for example? But a Bloomberg intelligence analyst is saying that that is very unlikely. We know the government has not been keen to orchestrate any sort of bailout of property developers. They have been prioritizing protecting homeowners. So what we could see perhaps is some guarantee around home completion, for example, and this would also help to at least recover confidence in the company, help creditors recover prospect for recover their credit. And this comes after the company had previously also just said that they do have enough cash to pay back some coupons that are due tomorrow, as well as another big bond that is maturing next Monday as well. So we have seen its bond prices really whipsawing. It halted trading last week after losing about 20% or more in terms of prices. And then this week, it's halted trading because bond prices had surged more than 20% after news of that government intervention.
Mimi, we got the president himself speaking at a Lunar New Year event in Beijing. Did we get any more clues on his thinking about the economy?
Unfortunately, not very much, because this was a speech that he gave at a gathering of various political parties that don't belong to the Chinese Communist Party. And his speech, the message was pretty much the same as what we have heard before, calling for more proactive macroeconomic policies, for example, as well as more doubling down on this effort to boost China's science and tech self-sufficiency as well.
Right, Bloomberg's China correspondent Min Min Lo there joining us with the latest on China. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. European futures in the green right now, as we saw also stocks rebound in the previous session on relief that President Trump did not impose sweeping trade tariffs on his first day in office. We'll have plenty more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
The golden age of America begins right now. Today, I will sign a series of historic executive orders. With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense. I will declare a national emergency at our southern border. All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came. The inflation crisis was caused by massive overspending and escalating energy prices, and that is why today I will also declare a national energy emergency. My proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier.
President Trump speaking in Washington during his inaugural address and, of course, not imposing those sweeping trade tariffs that markets had worried about. And we're seeing the broad upside across equity markets in Asia being led higher by the ASX 200, not to mention the Kospi. We also have news from South Korea that they will tighten market cap and revenue delisting criteria. And they also plan delisting rule revisions to remove unqualified companies. So do watch out for that as we continue to watch the Korean won at the moment also strengthening. We're also getting some breaking news that Country Garden is set to resume trading at 9 a.m. local time today. The stock last traded on March of last year. Of course, we continue to watch the latest developments in the real estate space across China as we continue to see those questions about the viability of some of these companies as the economy continues to weaken. Right now, when it comes to the Nikkei, we're seeing gains of about 0.5%. The Japanese yen also continuing to strengthen in today's session, as we're seeing in the other side of the trade, the U.S. dollar under pressure and Treasury yields continuing to decline. Really recalculation about what the first few days of the Trump administration will look like, Paul.
All right, well, President Trump is, as we've been reporting, ordering the US to again pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, that withdrawal is going to take a year to go into effect, but it does signal Trump's commitments to rapidly overhauling US energy and climate policy. The spectre of the world's second biggest polluter leaving the Accord again has already shaken global climate diplomacy. Now, Trump also used his inaugural address to say that he'll end the Green New Deal and revoke regulations compelling greater US sales of electric vehicles. The president says this will empower him to keep his pledge to American auto workers to save the domestic industry. Let's take a look at how commodities prices are tracking. Of course, copper central to the decarbonisation effort globally, holding on to gains. In fact, it's up by about 1%. Iron ore also gamely holding on above $100 per tonne. In terms of those two commodities, we did hear from the world's biggest miner, BHP, a bit earlier. Saw second quarter iron ore output edging up about 1% on year. It does reflect rather sluggish Chinese steel demand at the moment. But copper output for BHP surged 17%. The company retained full year output guidance and is outperforming the ASX right now. Take a look at crude prices as well. They're a little bit softer, as we heard President Trump declaring a national energy emergency, plans to, quote, drill, baby drill and refill the U.S. strategic oil reserve right to the top. Well, let's bring in Bloomberg senior energy reporter Stephen Stapczynski for more on this. So, Stephen, the national energy emergency plans to drill. What are the immediate implications of this going to be for the oil price?
I think overall there's this expectation that Trump is going to bring in a lot more energy production, that he's going to be able to slash regulations to really help boost output. But what you're hearing on the ground as well from the executives that operate and own these energy companies is that they're a bit hesitant. They don't want to unleash an avalanche of oil production from shale wells in the United States for a number of reasons. One, for the last few years, they've been really kind of on this capital discipline view. They don't want to flood the market and push prices lower. That would threaten where they are. So Trump, yes, he's going to be slashing regulations. He's going to look at ways to provide leases for oil and gas production on federal land. He's also going to roll back different green regulations that the Biden administration had pushed through. But overall, how much more oil production can the U.S. produce? They can produce a lot, but do the energy companies actually want to produce it? That's a big question, and that's going to be what's going to be closely watched by the market going forward.
And what role will Asia play when it comes to buying all of this oil?
Yeah, I mean, I think the oil that's being exported, oil and gas as LNG that's being exported from the United States today, that's dictated by the market. So where prices are higher, that's where the shipments will go. Now, looking forward, there are things called long-term contracts, and those long-term contracts could be signed potentially for future projects that come online in 2027, 2028, 2029 by Asian companies. Now, we've already heard from government officials in Vietnam, Taiwan, as well as South Korea, that they're looking at ways to potentially purchase more liquefied natural gas from the United States to reduce their trade deficit. That's something that Trump has said, and while he hasn't pushed through tariffs on his first day, there is still a fear that universal tariffs will be an issue for countries that aren't trying to reduce their trade deficit. So energy is an easy win for some of these companies. And I do have to preface that, of course, this won't change trade flows immediately. You won't see a huge uptick in buying of energy because you just can't do it that quickly. But what could happen is it lays the groundwork for people buying from these projects a few years from now, thus allowing them to basically move forward with development and make these projects viable from 2027 and onward, and you see more production later this decade.
Bloomberg senior energy reporter Stephen Stepchinsky, thanks for that great context when it comes to Trump's energy policies. We do have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
President Trump has vowed to prioritize America's interests while touting a more aggressive stance abroad, but he also says his legacy will be as a peacemaker and a unifier. Well, let's get the view from Canberra now, bring in our Australia government reporter Ben Westcott. And Ben, from Australia's perspective, I guess the key thing is getting a clear answer on the future of AUKUS. What's being said in Canberra?
That's exactly right, Paul. So there was big exhalations this week after some very long pent-up holding of breath after Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the incoming Secretary of State, announced that he would be a strong supporter of AUKUS during his confirmation hearings. And that's the most high-profile, strongest support for AUKUS that we've seen from the Trump administration so far. So that answered a lot of questions, but we still haven't heard the president himself, President Trump, say that he supports AUKUS, say what his feelings are about it. And a number of the major sort of milestones will take place during or just after his presidency. We're expecting to see visits by US nuclear-powered submarines through Western Australia in 2027, at which time Mr. Trump will be president. And then just after he leaves the White House by about in the early 2030s, we'll see the sale of the first US nuclear-powered Virginia-class submarines to Australia. So he'll have a lot of say over how this deal comes to pass.
Ben, how deep can the conversations be between the new Trump administration and Australian leadership right now, when Australia is also headed to the polls in May and could see a huge reshuffle in government?
Yes, it's a very good question. And we're already seeing both sides argue over who would be the best placed to speak in Australia's interests with Donald Trump. But already we've seen some reach out between the two sides. We have seen Ambassador Kevin Rudd reaching out to the Trump camp for a number of months. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese spoke to President Donald Trump back when he was president-elect, shortly after his win, and Donald Trump told the Prime Minister that they would have a perfect relationship. So he's rolled that out many times. And finally, Foreign Minister Penny Wong became the first Australian Foreign Minister to attend a US inauguration today, when she attended President Donald Trump's second inauguration. So already we're seeing tentative reach out. Albanese has said he won't meet with Trump until a potential Quad meeting later this year. So quite a way to go yet. And that could be, in fact, it's almost certain to be after the Australian election. So it could be that Prime Minister Peter Dutton ends up meeting with Donald Trump. We'll have to see what the Australian result is.
All right, Bloomberg's Ben Westcott there in Canberra. Well, Australia's official National Day is coming up next Monday, and with it, the annual debate about whether the timing is right. January 26 marks the landing of Britain's first fleet in Sydney Cove in 1788, and this is regarded by many Indigenous peoples as Invasion Day, or the beginning of colonisation, dispossession and discrimination. And that has led to protests and calls to change the date of the national celebration. Well, let's discuss this some more and whether the mood is shifting with Rachel Busbridge, Associate Professor of Sociology at the Australian Catholic University. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us. Can you give us a sense of where public opinion stands on Australia Day right now, and whether it should be a day of national pride or a day of national shame?
So there are effectively two positions on the Australia Day. One is a position which you've identified, which is of changing the date. And so the argument underlying that is that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, January 26 represents a day of colonisation, dispossession, invasion, all of those sad and traumatic things. The other camp is effectively that the status quo is fine. January 26 is an appropriate day on which to celebrate. Over the past 10 years or so, we've seen that this movement to change the date has garnered some traction across Australian society. So there have been increasing instances of, for instance, local councils that have elected to not hold events on January 26, alternatively to replace them with something else. And we've also seen a number of large national bodies like Cricket Australia or Triple J also electing not to do things on January 26. So I'd say in the last 10 years, there's been a bit of a groundswell towards changing the date. But what's been quite marked in the last year is that there appears to be a little bit of a backlash to this movement to change the date. Remains fairly small, but we're just seeing small little signs like, for instance, some local governments which had previously made decisions on not celebrating on Australia Day or doing something else on January 26 have now reversed their decisions. So we seem to be, in a moment of a little bit of backlash.
Yeah, and we did, of course, have the Voice to Parliament referendum in 2023, and that failed, lost in all of the states as well as the popular vote as well. So if the date were to be changed, surely that would be political suicide for any party that attempted it.
Yeah, well, I certainly think that the no vote in the Voice referendum is a major factor in this kind of backlash. If anything, what it has signified is a move away from reconciliation in the public sphere in Australia. And it's also in some ways unleashed, I suppose, an anti-reconciliation form of politics from certain constituencies that have targeted things like welcome to countries, the flying of Aboriginal flags and things like that. So it's a significant shift.
Right. Rachel, hold on a second, because we're headed back to the Oval Office right now, where we're seeing President Trump now sign 1,500 pardons for 1,500 people. This is to fully pardon them. We were expecting him to pardon people convicted during the January 6th, 2021 U.S. Capitol attack. We're now seeing that President Trump will be pardoning supporters that were arrested during that Capitol riot back in 2021, January 6th. The expectation was for the pardon of people convicted of nonviolent offenses and perhaps even commute some of the sentences of others. We'll continue to watch the latest developments as we're seeing President Trump now back in the Oval Office with a lot of measures on the table, including those pardons for 1,500 people that were convicted during the January 6th, 2021 attacks. But Rachel, going back to you, let's talk a little bit more about what this day actually represents and how businesses are also trying to navigate this sensitive topic.
Yeah, well, I don't think there is one particular stance that businesses are taking on this issue. Some businesses, for instance, are allowing people to work on January 26th and take the day off another time of the year. Others are going about it in different ways. Obviously, the biggest event that happened recently was the Woolworths reversing its decision not to have Australia Day paraphernalia in its stores this year. Look, there's many views on this, but I think what is positive is that it's telling us that businesses, whether they're small or large, are having serious discussions and conversations about, I suppose, national history, their role in the community, and particularly their role in things like reconciliation and so on.
Do you see perhaps the Overton window on this whole debate moving somewhat? You mentioned that there has been something of a realignment of the public back towards national pride, particularly after the failure of the Voice referendum. Considering Western politics seems to be lurching to the right at the moment, is there no longer any shame in waving the flag?
There certainly is a significant rightward push in public discourse, and we need to take that into account. There's particularly been a hostility to what's perceived as diversity, equity and inclusion, or DEI, initiatives recently. Having said that, I think we also probably can't overplay it too much. The reality is that we're in a cost of living crisis, and this is the material conditions which are enveloping a number of societies and not just Australia. And what we tend to find in these types of situations is that people become less concerned about symbolic issues and more concerned about material things. So a softer interpretation might be to say that currently there are other issues which are more pressing for many people in the Australian public.
All right, Rachel Busbridge, Associate Professor of Sociology at the Australian Catholic University. Now, we've got more on Australia ahead every Tuesday, 11:40 a.m. if you're watching in Sydney. That is 8:40 a.m. in Hong Kong. Shery.
And President Trump back in the Oval Office in D.C. signing executive orders, and the latest was to send an action to fully pardon 1,500 people convicted during the January 6th Capitol attack. We know that right now there are more than 700 people who have been convicted of misdemeanor offenses in connection with January 6th. There are also hundreds others whose cases are still pending in court. You can hear President Trump now speaking as he's signing those executive orders. We heard that there could be around 100 executive orders on his first day in office. He signed an action designating cartels also as terror groups. We'll continue to get the latest from D.C. as we continue to see President Trump now back in the Oval Office with continuing to sign those executive orders. This is Bloomberg.
Well, we're thinking in terms of 25% on Mexico and Canada.
We're getting the latest from President Trump in the Oval Office, now signing executive orders. One right now that he signed an action to end some birthright citizenship. Now, this would be after years of proposing the constitutional change as a way to reduce undocumented immigration. Birthright citizenship means that someone born within the United States or U.S. territories are automatically given U.S. citizenship, and this is protected by the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, so it would also need to be addressed via the constitutional amendment. Take a listen to what he's saying right now.
Hundreds of billions of dollars from China because they were unable to terminate the tariffs I put on China because it was too much money and the budgets didn't work and other reasons too. No, I mean, we're going to have meetings and calls with President Xi. I spoke to President Xi last week, as you know. Did you know that? I had a very good phone call.
Did you stand with NATO at this moment? Are you planning to meet your NATO allies?
No, NATO has to pay more money. NATO has to pay 5%. We're in the Ukraine war by $200 billion more than NATO. It's ridiculous because it affects them a lot more. We have an ocean in between. And we've spent $200 billion more on Ukraine than NATO has spent. And they've got to equalize.
Did you talk to Xi about the Ukraine war?
Yeah.
Because China and Brazil together has a proposal to bring Russia and Ukraine to talk.
Oh, that's good. That's fine. I'm ready.
When are you going to talk with the Brazilian president?
How did Brazil get involved? This is a new one.
When are you going to talk to Lula?
Are you from Brazil?
I'm from Brazil.
That's why they're involved, I guess.
When are you going to talk with the Brazilian president? How do you see our relationship with Latin America and Brazil?
Great. Should be great. They need us. much more than we need them. We don't need them. They need us. Everybody needs us.
This is Mr. President, it sounds like you will not proceed with additional China tariffs necessarily, depending on how talks go with President Xi. Is that correct?
What does that define that?
Well, we were asking, you pledged in the campaign potentially a 10% tariff on China or as much as
because of fentanyl.
Right. So I'm asking where you're...
That's only because of fentanyl. There are other things, too.
Are additional...
And a very big thing is the Panama Canal. China controls the Panama Canal. What's that all about? They're not supposed to be good. When Jimmy Carter gave it, which was a terrible mistake, he didn't do it. He didn't give it to China. He gave it to Panama. And China controls the Panama Canal.
So are China tariffs
and we're not going to allow that to happen.
Are they still on the table, or is that...
We're not going to allow that to happen.
Thank you, sir.
What can we expect of the countries in NATO that spend the least amount of money, like Spain, France, below the 5%?
Spain is very low. And yet, are they a BRICS nation?
What?
They're a BRICS nation, Spain. You know what a BRICS nation is? You'll figure it out. But, and if the BRICS nations want to do that, that's okay, but we're going to put at least a 100% tariff on the business they do with the United States. You know what the BRICS is, right? You guys know.
Brazil,
you know what I'm saying, right? You know what I'm saying.
So
it's not even a threat. In fact, since I made that statement, Biden said, well, they have us over a barrel. I said, no, we have them over a barrel. And there's no way they're going to be able to do that.
This is an executive order relating to
tariffs, those countries, like Spain?
As a BRICS nation, yes. They'll have a 100% tariff if they so much as even think about doing what they thought.
Can you explain how it's...
And therefore they'll give it up immediately. So will China give it up.
Sir, this is about reforming the system of hiring in the federal government to ensure that merit is the lodestar of hiring decisions
as per the Supreme Court.
Other matters. Yes, sir.
This is a big deal. Merit. Our country is going to be based on merit again. Can you believe it?
Mr. President, you had said you would end the Russia-Ukraine war on your first day in office. Where do things stand right now, and how do you intend?
Well, there's only half a day. I have another half a day left. We'll see. We want to get it done.
This is an order creating...
You're seeing the big reaction across currency markets, especially with strength on the Canadian weakness on the Canadian dollar and Mexican peso, as President Trump reiterates tariffs against them that could take effect on February 1st. That's it for the Asia trade. The China Open is next. This is Bloomberg.